We are back with more of our conversation with Amal and George Clooney. Look at the way these two look at each other. I can't get over this. The power couple joined us in studio on a very big day for them. It was their 8th wedding anniversary.
For 20 years, George Clooney told anyone who would listen that marriage was not for him. He said it to Barbara Walters. He said it to Esquire. He said it to Rolling Stone. And then one woman walked into his house on the shore of Lake Como, and within a year the most famous bachelor in the world was down on one knee. This is the real story of how it happened, told through the people who actually watched it unfold. To understand why George Clooney's transformation felt so unbelievable to the people around him, you have to understand how deep his resistance to marriage really ran. His first marriage, to actress Talia Balsam, lasted from 1989 to 1993. Shortly after divorcing her, he told Barbara Walters that he would never marry again, explaining simply that he wasn't very good at it. That single sentence became the line he repeated, almost word, for nearly 2 decades. In 2006, when people named him sexiest man alive, he was asked again, "Marriage? Who knows? I've been married. It's not something I'm looking out for," he said, adding that things could change but it wasn't a consideration at the time. In 2008, he told a British newspaper he didn't expect to ever marry or have children again, joking that he was never home and that no woman could put up with him for long. By 2011, he was telling Rolling Stone he'd already answered the marriage question back in 1997 and hadn't addressed it since. As late as January 2014, only months before he got engaged, he was still saying it publicly. He told Esquire he'd never really had aspirations toward marriage, that he wasn't good at it the first time, and that he'd said he'd never do it again right after the divorce and simply never revisited the subject. This was not a man playing coy for the cameras. This was a pattern that held for 21 years, through a string of high-profile relationships with women like Elisabetta Canales, Stacy Keibler, and Krista Allen, none of which changed his answer. The person who watched this version of George Clooney up close for longer than almost anyone else in Hollywood was Brad Pitt. Their history goes back to the early 1990s, when both men auditioned for the same role in Thelma and Louise. Pitt got the part that made him a star. Clooney, by his own admission, spent years afterward barely able to watch the film. He told GQ the experience stung enough that he avoided watching Thelma and Louise for a couple of years, joking about how fast Pitt's career took off while his own stalled on forgettable television. Despite that rocky start, the two built one of the most enduring friendships in the industry, working together across the Ocean's trilogy, Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, Burn After Reading, and years later, Wolves. In a joint 2024 interview with GQ, both men described what actually keeps their friendship alive after more than 3 decades. Clooney said they check in on each other regularly because life gets complicated and you have to make sure everybody is okay. Pitt echoed that, saying Clooney is one of the few people who understands the way he thinks through problems, and that he calls George on numerous occasions when things get bumpy. That is a friendship built on decades of proximity, not tabloid speculation, and it means Pitt has had a genuine close-up view of Clooney across every phase of his adult life. The bachelor years, the wedding, the twins, and everything since. The two have never pretended their bond runs on constant contact. In a joint interview promoting Wolves in 2024, Clooney joked that the two of them can go years without speaking, and that the friendship survives anyway because neither of them needs to fill the silence to know it's still there. It's a friendship built more on shared history than daily check-ins, which is exactly why Pitt's read on Clooney's evolution, formed across 3 decades of film sets, red carpets, and long stretches of not speaking at all, carries more weight than a passing tabloid theory ever could. The moment that actually changed the trajectory of Clooney's life happened in July 2013, and by his own account, it happened almost by accident. He was at his home on Lake Como when a mutual friend called and asked if he could stop by and bring along a friend of his own. Clooney said yes without thinking twice about it. That friend turned out to be Amal Alamuddin, a British-Lebanese barrister who was passing through Italy. Clooney later revealed that his own agent had called him beforehand and told him, almost as a joke, that a woman was coming to his house who he was going to marry, and that it turned out to be exactly right. His parents happened to be visiting Lake Como that same weekend, so his mother and father met their future daughter-in-law at the same moment he did. Clooney has said the group stayed up talking all night, and that he got her email address under the pretense of receiving some photos of his parents. What followed wasn't an instant romance. The two spent months writing to each other by email and talking about what was happening in their respective lives before either of them acknowledged it had become something more than friendship. Amal herself later described the feeling to Vogue in 2018, saying that before meeting George she had hoped love could exist without so much deliberation, and that meeting him felt like the most natural thing in the world once it happened. Their first real date came a few months later, in October 2013, when Clooney invited Amal to London while he was overseeing the musical score for his film Monuments Men. He chose to meet her at Abbey Road Studios, reasoning that if he was ever going to impress someone, that was the place to do it. Afterward they went to dinner at a fashionable spot Amal picked, and when they left, 50 photographers were waiting outside, a preview of exactly the kind of scrutiny their relationship would face going forward. Clooney later said she handled the swarm of paparazzi like a professional, which mattered to him because it showed him how she would manage the part of his life that had ended every previous relationship. By early 2014, the two were traveling together, including a safari trip to Kenya where Amal's love of giraffes gave Clooney the moment he later pointed to as the one where he knew he wanted to marry her. The proposal itself happened on April 28, 2014 at home, over a dinner George cooked himself. He asked Amal to get a lighter from a drawer to light a candle. When she reached in, she found a ring instead. He had a playlist of songs by his late aunt, singer Rosemary Clooney, queued up, and he got down on one knee and waited, by his own account, for a full 20 minutes, while Amal stared at the ring in shock before finally saying yes. 6 months later, on September 27, 2014, the two married in Venice at the Amman Canal Grande Hotel in front of roughly 100 friends and family. Amal's mother later told people the 3 days of celebration were unforgettable, calling the wedding legendary because of the friends, the family, and the atmosphere surrounding it. 3 years later, in June 2017, the couple became parents to twins, Ella and Alexander, born at St. Mary's Hospital in London. Clooney has described the moment he learned Amal was carrying twins as something close to disbelief, recalling the doctor confirming a second baby and him assuming there had been some kind of mistake on the paperwork. Fatherhood, arriving at 56, reshaped his daily life in ways that decades of stardom hadn't. He has spoken candidly about how differently his twins developed from one another despite being raised in the exact same environment, telling Good Morning America that watching them made him realize how little control a parent actually has over who a child becomes. What makes the story even more interesting is that Clooney has been remarkably consistent about crediting Amal, specifically, for the shift, not marriage in the abstract. On the Smartless podcast he described being swept off his feet by a woman who was brilliant, funny, and kind all at once, and admitted the two got engaged within months of meeting and married within their first year together, a pace that stunned people who had known him for decades. Amal has described the same period in strikingly similar terms. In her 2018 Vogue interview, she said that at 35 she had started to become resigned to the idea that marriage and a family might simply not happen for her, and that meeting George changed that assumption almost overnight. Neither of them describes a whirlwind fantasy engineered for the tabloids. Both describe something closer to relief. Two people who had each independently stopped expecting to find a partner, finding one in each other. What makes Clooney and Amal's marriage genuinely unusual isn't scandal. It's how little conflict either of them describes. In a 2025 interview with CBS News, Clooney said flatly that he and Amal have never had a real fight since they met in 2013. Adding that people tend to get annoyed when he says it because it sounds implausible. Whether that reflects two people who are simply that compatible, or two people who have found a way to work through disagreement without it ever looking like a fight to the outside world, is something only they can really answer. What's clear from Clooney's own words is that the marriage runs on a division of very different worlds. Amal built her career on serious, high-stakes legal and human rights work, advising on Syria negotiations at the United Nations, representing clients in international courts, campaigning on press freedom. George's world remained built on film sets, premieres, and the machinery of celebrity. Balancing those two lives, by his own telling, became one of the defining tasks of his 40s and 50s. If there's one relationship that shows the version of George Clooney that existed before Amal, and that still exists comfortably alongside her, it's his friendship with Julia Roberts. The two met in 2000, just before filming Ocean's 11, and have gone on to make 6 films together, a run that includes Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, Ocean's 12, Money Monster, and Ticket to Paradise. Roberts has described the connection as instant, telling Jimmy Kimmel that most people you meet you either dislike for no particular reason or you know instantly you'll be close to for the rest of your life, and that George was the second kind. Their bond deepened during the filming of Ticket to Paradise in Australia in 2022, a shoot that kept Roberts away from her own husband and 3 children for months. Amal and the twins came along with George for the production, and the Clooney family effectively adopted Roberts for the duration. Clooney told the New York Times that Roberts' house was situated just below his own during filming, and that the two families fell into an easy daily rhythm together, with George bringing coffee down to her in the mornings. Roberts herself said the Clooneys effectively saved her from loneliness during that stretch, noting it was the longest she had been away from her own family since she was 25 years old. Amal spoke about that same period publicly, describing how much time the two families spent together and calling the experience wonderful. Naturally, decades of on-screen chemistry between two of the most photographed people on the planet have invited constant speculation about whether there was ever more to it. Clooney has addressed that directly more than once. He told Access Hollywood that the friendship never became anything more romantic simply because of timing. One of them was always already in a relationship when the other was single, so it never had room to become something else. Roberts, for her part, has drawn a fairly clear parallel between her own marriage and Clooney's. She told Today in 2022 that she met her husband, Danny Moder, when she was ready for him, in the same way George met Amal when he was ready, and that both of them only welcomed children into their lives once they felt prepared to actually partner with them. That is not the language of two people circling something unresolved. It's the language of two people who found the life-defining relationship they were looking for elsewhere, and who happen to genuinely enjoy each other's company on top of it. So what does all of this actually tell us about why George Clooney, after 21 years of very public, very consistent resistance, finally chose to marry again? The honest answer isn't a secret Brad Pitt uncovered, or a rivalry with Julia Roberts that never existed in reality. It's something simpler and in its way more interesting. Clooney spent 2 decades building a life that worked extremely well for him. Total freedom, total mobility, no one to answer to but himself. His own words, over and over, describe a man who had made peace with being alone rather than risk repeating what he considered a failed marriage in his 20s. What changed wasn't that he suddenly wanted marriage. It was that he met one specific person whose life, work, and character made the alternative, staying uncommitted, feel like the bigger loss. He has said as much himself, telling the Smartless podcast that Amal simply took his breath away, and that getting engaged within months surprised him more than it surprised anyone watching from the outside. The friendships that surround that marriage, with Pitt, who has known him since before any of it, and with Roberts, who represents the freewheeling, joke-cracking version of George that predates Amal by over a decade, aren't threats to it. They're the connective tissue of a very long career, populated by people who have watched him change in real time and who, by their own accounts, still recognize him. Roberts wore a gown covered in Clooney's face to his 2022 Kennedy Center honors and called him a modern Renaissance man during her speech, a joke rooted in 22 years of genuine affection, not tension. Pitt, for his part, still calls Clooney when he needs someone who understands the way he processes a problem before he's even said much about it out loud. What's actually remarkable about George Clooney's story isn't a hidden scandal. It's the fact that a man who spent 21 years insisting, on the record, in interview after interview, that he was done with marriage for good, was willing to completely reverse course the moment he found a reason that actually mattered to him. He has said the whole thing surprised him more than it surprised anyone else in the world, and that everyone else was pretty surprised too. More recently, now in his 60s, Clooney has spoken about the ticking clock in a different way. He told the New York Times that he and Amal have talked about focusing on the next 20 or 25 years and making sure they don't waste any of the time they have together, adding that no one at the end of their life ever wishes they had spent more time working. That's not the voice of a man performing a fairy tale for the cameras. It's the voice of someone who spent half his life avoiding a commitment, found the one person who made it worth the risk, and is still, all these years later, trying to make the most of the time that's left. He's even talked about the 17-year age gap between him and Amal as part of what pushes him to stay present rather than coast. He told the New York Times that he can still run the court and do most of what he could at 30, but that in 30 years he'll be 90, and that's a real number worth planning around, not something to wave away with wishful thinking. That's a man doing the opposite of resting on a fairy tale. It's someone actively working to make sure the second half of the story he once swore would never happen doesn't get taken for granted. That's the real story, not a scandal, not a secret exposed by a famous friend, but a very public, very well-documented change of heart, told almost entirely in George Clooney's own words.